Creating graphical presentations are hard to understand, especially if you don't know how to deliver those information to your audience. What are the aspects to consider in creating your visuals? Are there any techniques that you can use to effectively communicate to your audience? And what are the things that you should avoid? In this video, we will be answering those questions. So if you are interested, just keep on watching.
Now let us discuss the visuals that are commonly used in data presentation. The first one we're gonna talk about is the simple text. Sometimes we use too many images or graphs to present our data, and sometimes it results to our audience being lost in the endless photos. As an alternative, we can use simple text whenever we only have a number or two to share. In this way, we can clearly communicate our message to the audience. Think about solely using the number and a few supporting words to make your point. You must remember that the fact that you have some numbers do not mean that you need to use images or graphs. You can always present these numbers in a big bold text called the simple text visualization. Next, we have the scatter plot. Scatter plot is a list of ordered pairs that can be useful for showing the relationship between two things. They tend to be more frequently used in scientific fields due to its capacity to encode data simultaneously and find out what relationship exists between the two variables. For example, you want to use this data to understand or show your audience whether or not the cost for advertisement can affect the items sold by your company. An easier way to do this is to put the data in the scatter chart, and you can easily see here that increasing your advertising budget will increase your items sold. Then, we have the table. When you have more data that you want to communicate, generally, table or graph is the way to go. Tables interact with our verbal system, which means that we read them. Tables are great for communicating to a mixed number of audience whose member will each look for a particular row of interest. For example, when teacher posts the grades of his students, using table will make it more easier for the students to find where they are and understand the data being presented.
Hi there! Now let us move on to heat maps. When we think of heat, we think of actual temperature, right? That is not the case with heat maps, because a heat map is actually a graphical representation of data in two dimensions, using colors to demonstrate different factors. Heat maps are a helpful visual aid for a viewer, enabling the quick dissemination of statistical or data-driven information. Here is a quick example. In the example, we can see the clear difference between a normal data table and a heat map. In the heat map, we can clearly see how the bigger data has a darker shade of color and the smaller data has a lighter shade of color. Now let us move on to line graphs. There are two types of line graphs. These are the standard line graph and the slope graphs. First is the line graphs. It is a graph which uses the lines to connect individual data points to display quantitative values over a time interval. Here is an example of a line graph. In the example of a line graph, we can clearly see what product had a clear increase in their demand and what product had a clear decrease in their demand. Now let's move on to slope graphs. Slope graphs can be useful when you have two time periods or points of comparison and want to quickly show relative increases and decreases between the two data points. Here is a quick example. Now, as we can see in the slope graph example, we the audience can clearly determine what survey category had an increase or decrease in the next year. Thank you, that is all for line graph.
Vertical bar chart. A vertical bar chart is the most common type of bar graph, and it is also referred to as column graph. It represents the numerical value of research variables using vertical bars, whose lengths are proportional to the quantities that they represent. The data categories are placed on the horizontal axis of the graph, while the numerical value is placed on the vertical axis of the graph. Horizontal bar chart. A horizontal bar chart is also a type of bar graph that usually represents data variables by using proportional horizontal bars. Horizontal bar chart is completely the opposite of vertical bar chart. Here, the data categories are placed on the vertical axis of the graph, while the numerical value is placed on the horizontal axis of the graph. Horizontal bar charts are often used to represent comparisons between nominal variables. If I had to choose a graph for a categorical data, I would prefer the horizontal bar graph. Stack vertical bar charts. Stack vertical bar chart is also a type of bar graph that uses vertical bars in order to compare individual data variables. This statistical tool stacks data categories so that each bar shows the total number of subcategories that makes up a data set. In simple explanation, categories are represented as bars, as in a basic vertical bar graph, but the bars are composed of series that are stacked on top of each other, with each series representing its value. Therefore, the height of the entire stack represents the total of all series in that category.
After learning about the other graphs and charts, let us now go to the last three types in this lesson. The next chart is similar to the stacked vertical, except that it is horizontally oriented. Stacked horizontal bar chart is a chart that uses bars to show comparisons between categories of data, but with the ability to break down and compare parts of a whole. Each bar in the chart represents a whole, and segments in the bar represent different parts or categories of that whole. As you can see in the example, it compares the sales of book genres over the years. A whole bar represents the whole year, and the segments are the number of genres bought in that said year. Stacked bars do a good job of featuring the total and also providing a hint as to how the total for each category value is divided into parts. Next is the waterfall chart. A waterfall chart is used to show how an initial value is increased and decreased by a series of intermediate values leading to a final value. Waterfall chart is widely used in the finance sector to exhibit how a net value is arrived at by breaking down the aggregate effect of positive and negative contributions. This chart is effective in displaying gradual changes in the quantitative value of something over time as it uses a clear structure. For our last graph, we have the square area. Square area graph is also known as a waffle chart. This graph is best used when you need to compare numbers of vastly different magnitudes. With bars, you only either get height or width, whereas with a square, you get it both. This allows us to compare numbers of different magnitudes in a more condensed space. The square area graph can also sometimes work as an alternative to the pie chart. It's worth noting that because we are looking at areas. This chart type does fall victim to some of the same challenges as the pie chart, like when measuring the areas. However, in area graphs, the squares are the baselines that can be used for comparison, which is an edge for this type. And that's all for the types of charts and graphs.
Let us now move on to the things that we should avoid in creating graphical presentations. The first on the list are pie charts. Let's start with this presentation. Based on your observation, can you determine which part is bigger, the red or the green? Many will answer that it is the red one simply because it looks wider than the green one. Apparently, the green one is bigger. Pie graphs are sometimes deceiving. It focuses on what we see than the actual data itself. It is the same with three-dimensional perspective that we will discuss later. The human eye isn't good at ascribing quantitative value to two-dimensional space. So in short, pie graphs are not an effective tool in presenting data. So what can be your alternatives? We have horizontal graphs. Use horizontal bar chart to create a more organized category. See, it is easier to create and understand. Next is never use 3D. Just like pie graphs, three-dimensional shapes are tricky in the eyes. You can only use it when plotting a three-dimensional space. As we saw in the pie chart, 3D distorts our numbers, making them difficult and impossible to interpret or compare. And last but not the least is the secondary y-axis. Sometimes, it is useful to be able to plot data that is entirely different against the same axis. This often gives rise to secondary y-axis, which is another vertical axis on the right-hand side. So what are the things that you can do instead of creating another y-axis? Instead, think about whether one of the following approaches will meet your needs. First, Don't show the second y-axis. Instead, label the data points that belong to this axis directly. Second, pull the graphs apart vertically and have a separate y-axis for each or both of the left, but leverage the same x-axis across both. So you see, graphical presentation requires you to create and organize your data through graphs. You should be able to organize your data and create graphs that are relevant to the information you are providing so that customers or audience will easily understand what you are presenting. And that's all for how to choose an effective visual. Hope you understand something. Thanks for watching.